who went to a wedding where the couple didn't last long. What happened? The bride, let's call her Amanda, had been through the ringer. She was in her late 20s, but life had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with years. She had this quiet strength about her, but there was also an undeniable sadness, a resignation to her situation that was hard to ignore. She was the type of person who deserved better. Someone who worked hard and tried to do right by everyone around her, but instead of a partner, she ended up with a leech. The groom, let's call him Mike, was a piece of work, the kind of guy who makes you question how some people manage to convince others to spend their lives with them. Mike was your typical scumbag, a guy who'd rather find ways to scam the system than actually work for a living. He had this sleazy charm about him that probably seemed attractive in a bad boy kind of way. But underneath it all, he was just lazy and manipulative. He was living off Amanda, who was juggling 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. It's one thing to fall on hard times and need some support, but it's another to deliberately take advantage of someone's kindness and hard work, and Mike was all about the latter. He was the kind of guy who thought the world owed him something, and he had no problem taking it from whoever was naive enough to give it to him. To make matters worse, they had a newborn together, a sweet little baby who had no idea the mess she was born into. And as if that wasn't enough, Amanda had 2 other kids from a previous relationship, kids who Mike had somehow convinced to call him Daddy. That's what really turned my stomach. The way he wormed his way into those kids' lives, pretending to be a father figure while barely lifting a finger to actually help raise them. He'd parade them around like trophies. But when it came to the real work of being a parent, he was nowhere to be found. The wedding itself was a joke, held at Mike's parents' house, a rundown place that had seen better days, though I doubt those days were ever that great to begin with. The house was small, cramped, and had this air of neglect about it, like no one really cared about keeping it up. It was the kind of place where you could tell the people living there had given up on appearances long ago, content to let things fall apart around them. In a way, it was the perfect setting for what was about to unfold. The ceremony was officiated by one of Mike's buddies, a guy who had gotten ordained online, specifically for this event. You know the type, someone who probably thought it'd be hilarious to play preacher for a day, not really taking it seriously. And why would he? It was clear from the get-go that this wedding was more about going through the motions than celebrating any real love or commitment. The whole thing felt like a sham, a poorly constructed facade hiding the ugly truth underneath. From the moment I walked in, I knew this wasn't going to be one of those weddings where you leave feeling uplifted and hopeful about love. No, this was something else entirely. A spectacle, a farce. The air was thick with tension, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And it didn't take long for that to happen. Mike was already half drunk by the time the ceremony started, stumbling around and laughing loudly with his friends, as if this was just another party. He didn't seem to care that this was supposed to be his wedding day, a day to celebrate his commitment to Amanda. Instead, he acted like he was at a frat party, flirting with every woman who crossed his path and making a fool of himself in front of everyone. When it came time for the first dance, a moment that should have been special, Mike was nowhere to be found. He was out on the dance floor with some other woman, laughing and joking like he didn't have a care in the world. Amanda stood there, waiting for him, her face a mixture of embarrassment and hurt. When he finally did come over for their dance, he barely spent a few seconds with her before cutting it short and moving on to dance with his mother for a full song. It was like he was trying to make a point, to show everyone where his loyalties really lay, and it wasn't with his new wife. That was just the beginning. The night only got worse from there, a series of humiliations that made it clear just how little Mike cared about Amanda or their marriage. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. You knew it was going to end badly, but you couldn't look away. The reception felt like stepping into some twisted alternate reality where everyone was in on a cruel joke except for the bride. Amanda was seated at a small table in the corner, alone except for the newborn cradled in her arms. Her dress, once white and full of promise, now seemed out of place against the backdrop of this cold, heartless event. The baby fussed quietly, oblivious to the tension swirling around, but Amanda rocked her gently, trying to keep it together despite the sting of isolation. Across the room, Mike was holding court at a table surrounded by women, laughing, flirting, acting like he didn't have a care in the world. He was in his element, soaking up the attention while Amanda sat alone, visibly shrinking into herself with every passing moment. It was like watching someone slowly suffocate, and yet no one in that room seemed to notice or care. The room was filled with people, but it felt empty, like everyone was a shadow, just going through the motions. Even the decorations, probably chosen with care by Amanda, seemed to mock her. Flowers that should have symbolized new beginnings were wilting under the weight of this farce, and the cheerful music playing in the background only highlighted the misery of the situation. My wife, who was the only bridesmaid that actually seemed to care about Amanda, sat with her, doing her best to offer some support. The other bridesmaids, all part of Mike's orbit, were scattered around the room, mingling with guests, oblivious, or maybe indifferent to the bride's distress. They treated Amanda like an afterthought, a stranger at her own wedding, while lavishing attention on Mike and his antics. As the night dragged on, things only got worse. Mike and his buddies started dancing, but it wasn't the kind of dancing you'd expect at a wedding. No, this was the kind of dirty, suggestive dancing you'd see at a club, and it was clear that the only thing on Mike's mind was having a good time. Amanda be damned. He didn't even glance her way as he ground up against other women, laughing like this was the best night of his life. And there she was, Amanda, sitting quietly with her baby, trying to put on a brave face, but failing miserably. Every now and then she'd look over at Mike, and you could see the hurt in her eyes, the pain of realizing that the man she just married didn't care about her, at least not in the way she deserved. But what could she do? She was stuck, trapped in this nightmare with no way out. The final straw came when Amanda, clearly upset, decided she couldn't take it anymore. She stood up, holding her baby, and walked over to Mike. You could see the determination in her eyes. She was going to confront him, tell him exactly how she felt. But before she could even get a word out, Mike's parents swooped in like vultures. His mother, who had been sitting nearby, watching everything with a sour expression, snatched the baby right out of Amanda's arms. The shock on Amanda's face was palpable, but it quickly turned to anger as she tried to take her baby back. That's when Mike's father, a man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, got up and started yelling at Amanda, telling her she was embarrassing herself and needed to leave. Leave? The words hung in the air like a death sentence. This was Amanda's wedding. Her one day that was supposed to be about her, about celebrating her love and commitment, and now she was being kicked out. By her in-laws, no less. Amanda pleaded with them, tears streaming down her face, but they wouldn't hear any of it. They just kept yelling, calling her names, telling her she wasn't welcome. Mike stood there, silent, watching it all unfold without lifting a finger to help his wife. He didn't even try to take the baby back from his mother. He just stood there, looking at Amanda like she was some kind of nuisance that he wished would just go away. In that moment, it was like everything broke inside of her. Amanda, who had been holding on so tightly to the hope that things might get better, finally realized that they wouldn't. She was alone, completely, utterly alone in a room full of people. And so, with one last look at her husband, she turned and walked out, leaving the baby behind. As she left, you could hear the whispers and see the smirks on people's faces. To them, this was just another piece of drama to gossip about later. But to Amanda, it was the moment her world fell apart. She was thrown out of her own wedding, separated from her child, all because she dared to stand up for herself against the mistreatment. My wife was devastated, torn between wanting to go after Amanda and needing to stay behind to witness the aftermath. She stayed, and we both watched as Mike went right back to his flirting and partying as if nothing had happened. His parents sat down with the baby, cooing over her like they were the ones who just won some kind of twisted victory. That night was supposed to be the start of a new life for Amanda, but instead, it was the end of whatever hope she had left. She didn't deserve any, and to this day, I can't understand how someone like Mike could have so much power over her. It's a memory that still makes my blood boil, a reminder that not all weddings are happy occasions, and sometimes they're nothing but the beginning of the end. The aftermath of that wedding was a nightmare that just wouldn't end. For Amanda, it was like the ground had been ripped out from under her, and she was left free-falling with no end in sight. After being kicked out of her own wedding and separated from her newborn, she spent 3 days in a state of panic and despair. She called every number she could think of. Mike, his parents, even some of the guests. But they either ignored her or worse, mocked her desperation. It was like she was nothing to them, just a nuisance to be dealt with. My wife and I were beside ourselves, trying to figure out how to help. We had watched it all go down, helpless to intervene at the time, but we couldn't just sit back and do nothing afterward. Amanda was staying at a friend's house, too scared to go back to the home she shared with Mike. Not that it felt like a home anymore. We drove over to see her, and when she opened the door, I hardly recognized the Amanda I knew was always tired, sure, but this was something different. She was broken, like a part of her had been stripped away in those 3 days. She told us how she'd been on the phone non-stop, begging Mike's parents to let her see her baby. She knew they were keeping her out of spite, as some twisted way to punish her for standing up for herself at the wedding. But they didn't care about the law or what was right. They only cared about their control over her and that child. It wasn't until Amanda threatened to involve the authorities that things started to change. When Amanda finally went to the sheriff's department, I think that was the first time she really understood the gravity of what had happened. The deputies there took her seriously, more seriously than anyone else had in those 3 awful days. When she explained the situation, the sheriff himself got involved, and they didn't waste any time. They knew this was more than just a domestic dispute. This was a potential kidnapping, and they weren't going to let it slide. The next few hours were a blur of activity. The sheriff's department sent officers to Mike's parents' house with a clear message: return the baby or face kidnapping charges. And they weren't bluffing. They had the paperwork ready to file warrants and start a full-scale search if it came to that. The thought of police swarming their house must have scared Mike's parents, because they finally agreed to hand over the baby, but not without trying to spin it as if they were the ones doing Amanda a favor. When Amanda got her baby back, the relief on her face was overwhelming. She held that child so close, like she was afraid to let go, even for a second. But the nightmare was far from over. Getting her baby back was just one battle won in what was shaping up to be a long, drawn-out war. The truth about Mike came out in bits and pieces over the following weeks. As it turned out, the wedding hadn't even been legal. Mike hadn't bothered to file the marriage certificate, and part of me wondered if that had been his plan all along. A way to keep Amanda trapped without giving her any legal rights as his wife. It was just another layer of deceit in a relationship that had been built on nothing but lies and manipulation from the start. Amanda now had full custody of her children, which was a small victory. But Mike wasn't done tormenting. He found new ways to make her life miserable, harassing her constantly. He'd show up at her work, spreading lies, trying to ruin her reputation. He'd call her at all hours, leaving nasty messages, threatening to take the kids away, telling her she was worthless. It was like he was determined to break her completely, even though he'd already done so much damage. There's something about witnessing that level of cruelty that changes you. It's rare for me to feel real, deep down hatred for someone. But Mike, he's the kind of person who brings that out. If I ever saw him in a dark alley, I wouldn't hesitate to take him down. No questions, no second thoughts. The way he treated Amanda, the way he used her and threw her away when she stood up for herself, it's the kind of thing that makes your blood boil, that keeps you up at night thinking about what you could have done differently to help.